The wind outside tonight carries a whisper, doesn't it? A sound like distant voices or branches clawing at an unseen window. It's a familiar kind of chill, the one that tells you something old and unsettling is stirring, just beyond the edge of your perception. Tonight, we're going to lean into that feeling. We're going to explore what lies hidden, what waits patiently, and what, once awakened, refuses to ever truly sleep again. Find your quietest corner, turn off the lights, and put your headphones on. Because the stories we're sharing tonight have a way of lingering long after the screen goes dark. They get under your skin, and sometimes they even change the way you look at the shadows in your own room. The key was heavy, tarnished brass, with an ornate etched into its head, which was odd because the cabin we were going to was supposed to be called Elk Ridge. My uncle, who was more of a distant relative my dad owed a favor to, had offered it up for a weekend getaway. I was 19, and my best friend, Alex, and I were looking for a cheap escape from our suffocating suburban summer. We packed a cooler with cheap soda and snacks, a couple of beat-up sleeping bags, and a few paperbacks. The drive was long, leaving behind cell service somewhere past the turnoff for Bear Creek, deep into the state forest land. It felt like we were driving to the edge of the world, which, at the time, was exactly what we wanted. The cabin itself was exactly what you'd expect. Rustic, nestled among towering pines, a small plume of smoke rising lazily from its stone chimney, though no one was supposed to be there. It was built from dark, rough-hewn logs, with a small porch that overlooked a dense patch of forest. The air was cool and smelled of pine needles and damp earth, a welcome change from the city's concrete heat. There was a faint, almost imperceptible hum in the air, but I figured it was just the wind through the tall trees. We parked the old pickup and got out, stretching our legs. The silence out there was profound, almost oppressive, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant caw of a crow. Inside, the cabin was dark and surprisingly well kept for how remote it was. A thick layer of dust coated everything, but it felt lived in, not abandoned. There was a stone fireplace, a couple of rickety armchairs, and a rough-hewn table in the main room. On that table, beneath a flickering oil lamp that someone had left lit, sat a book. It was bound in thick, black leather, unadorned, no title on the spine or cover. It looked ancient, its pages yellowed and brittle. I picked it up. It was surprisingly heavy, almost dense. Alex, ever the cautious one, just shrugged. Probably someone's old journal or something. Don't open it. It's probably full of boring stuff. He was right, of course. It was probably nothing, but something about its plainness felt off. I set the book down, a strange compulsion to open it warring with Alex's casual dismissal. We spent the rest of the evening setting up our sleeping bags, making a fire, and trying to get a rusty old radio to pick up anything besides static. The wind had started to pick up outside, rustling through the leaves, and the cabin creaked and groaned around us. Later, as we were winding down, I noticed something odd on the book. On the very edge of the black cover, barely visible in the dim light of the dying fire, were faint, almost scratched-in marks. They weren't letters I recognized, more like symbols or tiny, intricate designs, barely breaking the surface of the leather. They looked deliberate. I tried to brush it off, probably just wear and tear, or some random carvings from a previous occupant. But the next morning, the marks seemed clearer, almost pulsing faintly in the weak sunlight streaming through the cabin window. And then the whispers started. Faint, indistinct sounds like someone talking just beyond the range of hearing. I kept asking Alex if he heard it, but he just shook his head, blaming the wind. He was convinced I was just tired and letting the isolation get to me. I wasn't tired. I felt wide awake, hyper-aware of every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside. The whispers sounded like they were coming from everywhere and nowhere. A low, persistent hum beneath the natural sounds of the forest. That afternoon, while Alex was out trying to find a better radio signal, I explored the cabin more thoroughly. There was a small, locked wooden door in the back, barely noticeable, almost blending into the wall. I hadn't paid it any mind before, but now it drew my attention. I tried the handle. It was firmly shut. I looked around for a key, but found nothing. The whispers felt stronger near the door, weaving in and out of the sound of my own breathing. It felt like something was being kept behind it, something that wanted out. I pressed my ear against the wood, but heard nothing distinct, just that same unsettling, barely there murmur. My heart was pounding, a primal fear bubbling up. Later, as night fell again, a heavy fog rolled in, making the cabin feel even more isolated. The whispers intensified, sometimes sounding like they were right behind me, other times like they were coming from deep within the walls. Alex was getting annoyed with my constant questions about the sounds. He finally snapped, telling me to just ignore it. But how could I? It felt like the air itself was vibrating with unseen voices. The fire we had built crackled weakly, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to shift and writhe. I found myself staring at the black book on the table, the strange marks on its cover seeming to glow faintly now, almost imperceptibly, in the dim firelight. I knew I shouldn't, but I reached for it. My fingers brushed the cool, smooth leather. The marks felt rough under my touch. Then a thought struck me cold and sharp. The key. The one with the ornate C on it. I'd seen that symbol somewhere before. I grabbed the key from my pocket, its weight familiar in my palm. Holding it up next to the black book, I traced the design on the key's head. It was identical to one of the symbols etched into the book's cover. A small, intricate C woven with other strange lines. The whispers suddenly seemed to sharpen, coalescing into something almost understandable. The C wasn't just a letter for cabin. It stood for Selim, my uncle's last name. He owned this place. This wasn't Elk Ridge. It was the Selim cabin. And my uncle was a collector of very old, very strange things. I looked at the black book, then at the locked door. The whispers were loud now, a cacophony of voices, urgent and demanding. Alex was asleep, oblivious, his breathing steady. I knew with a terrifying certainty that the key belonged to that door, and I knew what was inside. Without another thought, I picked up the key, walked to the back of the cabin, and inserted it into the lock. It turned with a click, echoing loudly in the sudden, absolute silence that followed. I pushed the door open slowly. The room beyond was small, empty, and utterly dark. But the air was thick, heavy with an unseen presence. And the whispers, now silent, felt like they were pressing in on me from within that dark space. I didn't go in. Couldn't. I just stood there, staring into the oppressive blackness, the cold seeping from that room chilling me to the bone. I backed away slowly, closed the door, and locked it again. The whispers didn't return. Not then. I didn't wake Alex. We left before sunrise, not even bothering to pack everything. The black book still sitting on the table, the key still in my pocket. I never told Alex about the key, or the door, or the silence. He still thinks I got scared of some raccoons. I can't explain what happened, not really. But every now and then, late at night, when the house is quiet and the wind is just right, I can almost hear them again, those faint, insistent whispers, just at the edge of hearing, calling me back. It's easy to dismiss a strange sound, a flicker of movement in your peripheral vision, as nothing at all. Just the house settling or a trick of the light. But what if it's more? What if those tiny, insignificant moments are just the first thread in a much larger, darker tapestry? The key felt strangely warm in my palm, though it had been sitting on a cold stone ledge for days. My cousin, Mark, had convinced me to spend a week at his grandfather's old hunting cabin upstate. It was deep in the Adirondacks, a place so remote my phone barely had service. I was 17, itching for some independence and a break from my parents. So the idea of a week with just Mark, no rules, seemed perfect. The cabin itself was old, built from dark, rough-hewn logs, nestled so far back in the woods you could only hear the wind and the occasional bird. There was no electricity, just an old gas generator for a few lights, and a wood-burning stove. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already dipping below the tree line, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp earth and old wood smoke. Dust motes danced in the last shafts of sunlight filtering through the grimy windows. While Mark started hauling in our gear, I wandered around, curious. The place was sparsely furnished, a couple of rickety beds, a table, and a small, built-in bookshelf crammed with weathered paperbacks. Most were old adventure stories or tattered hunting guides, but one book stood out. It was bound in heavy, dark leather, almost black, with no title or author on the spine. It looked incredibly old, thicker than any other book on the shelf, and seemed to absorb the light around it. There was something about it that made my hand pause before touching it. I pulled it out, and the air around it felt strangely still, almost cold. The leather was smooth but stiff, like dried skin. There were no pages numbers, just dense, handwritten script in a language I didn't recognize, filled with sharp, angular symbols. It wasn't Latin or anything I'd ever seen in school. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper seemed to emanate from the book itself, a sound like dry leaves rustling in a distant wind, or perhaps just my imagination playing tricks. I snapped it shut, feeling a sudden chill. Mark called from the kitchen area, asking if I'd found the lanterns. I quickly shoved the book back onto the shelf, tucking it behind a stack of National Geographic magazines. Felt wrong, like something that shouldn't be touched. That night, after a dinner of canned beans and instant coffee, we sat by the fire, listening to the generator hum outside. Mark was telling a story about his grandpa encountering a bear near the cabin years ago. Suddenly, a faint thud came from outside, somewhere in the surrounding woods. Mark stopped talking. "Probably just a deer," he mumbled, but his eyes darted towards the window. A few minutes later, another thud, closer this time, followed by a crunching sound, like heavy footsteps on dry leaves. We both froze, listening. The sounds were too deliberate for an animal. After a long silence, Mark cleared his throat. "Generators probably just settling," he said, but his voice was thin. We decided to call it a night, the comfortable atmosphere having vanished. I tried to sleep, but the thuds and rustling sounds played over and over in my head. The generator's drone was usually a comfort, but now it just seemed to emphasize the silence between its mechanical thrums. Sometime in the deep hours of the night, a new sound started. A soft, rhythmic scratching, coming from outside my window. It wasn't frantic, like an animal trying to get in, but slow and steady, almost like someone was dragging a fingernail across the rough wood siding, just below the sill. I pulled the thin blanket tighter around me, my heart thudding. It continued for what felt like an eternity, a constant, abrasive whisper against the cabin wall. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to stop, trying to convince myself it was just a branch. The next morning, after a restless night, I found Mark already awake, looking drawn. He said he hadn't slept well either, hearing things. We had breakfast in silence, both of us jumpy. While Mark was outside checking the generator, I couldn't shake the memory of the black book. I pulled it out again, feeling that same unnatural chill. This time, I noticed something I hadn't before. On the rough wooden table beneath where the book had sat, was a small, perfectly round black stain, like dried ink. It was too dark, too precise to be just a spill. It looked like it had seeped through the very wood, a permanent mark. A cold dread seeped into me. This wasn't just an old book. It felt like a drain. That evening, the unsettling feeling only intensified. The scratching from the night before was now joined by what sounded like muffled dragging noises from the front porch. Mark and I looked at each other, wide-eyed. He grabbed the heavy iron poker from beside the stove. "Stay here," he whispered, and crept towards the front door. He slowly unlatched it and flung it open, poker held high. The porch was empty, completely empty. No one there, nothing disturbed, not even a leaf out of place on the wooden planks. But the air on the porch was undeniably colder, and I could swear I smelled something metallic, like old pennies, mixed with the usual pine scent of the woods. Mark stood there for a long moment, then slowly closed the door, his face pale. We were huddled by the fire, the single gas lamp casting flickering shadows, when Mark suddenly spoke, his voice unnervingly calm. "You know," he said, staring into the flames, "Grandpa always warned us about that book. He said it wasn't just for reading. He said it was a way to reach out." My blood ran cold. I hadn't told him about the book, or touching it, or the strange ink stain. He'd never even mentioned it before. He turned his head slowly towards me, and in the dim light, his eyes looked too wide, too dark. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper seemed to emanate from him. A sound like dry leaves rustling, exactly like what I thought I'd heard from the book. He smiled, a slow, unnatural stretching of his lips. I scrambled backward, knocking over my chair. His smile never faltered, but his gaze felt like a physical weight pressing down on me. "It just needed a little coaxing," he whispered, his voice sounding subtly different, deeper, with an odd resonance. "It always needs a fresh pair of eyes to see the words." I didn't wait. I bolted for the front door, fumbling with the latch, my fingers numb. The heavy bolt was jammed, twisted, as if someone had tried to force it from the outside. I slammed my shoulder against the door, adrenaline surging, then again and again, until with a splintering crack, the old wood around the lock gave way. I burst out into the pre-dawn darkness, not caring where I ran, just away. I ran until my lungs burned, not daring to look back, the sounds of the forest blurring into a single, terrifying roar. I eventually stumbled onto the dirt road that led back to civilization, the first hints of dawn painting the sky a pale, unsettling gray. I walked for hours, barely registering the cold or the stinging scratches on my arms. When I finally reached the nearest town, I called my parents from a payphone, incoherent with fear. They picked me up, confused and worried. I never told them, or anyone, exactly what happened at that cabin. I just said Mark and I had a fight. Mark never came back from the cabin. The sheriff's search found no trace of him, just the cabin door hanging open, the lock completely destroyed, and a strange, black stain on the wooden table. Years have passed, and I still can't shake the memory of his eyes, or that low, rustling whisper. I sometimes wonder if the cabin still stands, or if that book is still there, waiting. But what truly haunts me is not what I saw, but what Mark said about the book needing fresh eyes. I never read the words, never understood the language, but the silence, the cold, and the way Mark looked at me convinced me that I had opened something, even if just by touching it. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is still, I think I can hear a faint, dry rustling, just at the edge of my hearing, as if unseen words are still trying to find their way out. Sometimes, the most terrifying discoveries aren't found by seeking them out, but by simply paying closer attention to what's already there. The faded ink, the forgotten details, the quiet truths waiting to be uncovered, if only you dare to look. The key was heavy, tarnished brass, with a crude C scratched into it that looked less like a letter and more like a claw mark. My uncle, a man who believed in self-sufficiency to a fault, had left me his remote cabin deep in the Allegheny Mountains after he passed. I was 22, fresh out of college, and restless. The inheritance felt less like a gift and more like a test. The cabin was a small, two-room affair built from rough-hewn timber, tucked away at the end of a winding, unpaved road that disappeared into thick forest. No cell service, no internet, just the drone of cicadas and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. It was supposed to be a place to clear my head, maybe write that novel I always talked about. My first few days were spent sweeping cobwebs, chopping firewood, and trying to get the old well pump working. The air inside was thick with dust and the smell of old wood, like a forgotten memory. Uncle Silas had been a strange man, a recluse even by mountain standards. He'd lived here alone for decades. I found his sparse belongings, threadbare clothes, a worn Bible, a collection of old fishing lures. Nothing personal, nothing that spoke of a life beyond bare survival. The silence out there was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fireplace at night. It was the kind of quiet that pressed in on you, that made you feel like you were the only living thing for miles around. Then I found the book. It wasn't on a shelf or tucked in a drawer, but hidden beneath a loose floorboard near the hearth, almost as if someone had hastily concealed it. It was bound in thick, black leather, unadorned, with no title or author on the spine. The pages felt like parchment, and the ink was a deep, almost iridescent black. It was a journal written in Uncle Silas's cramped, precise hand. My initial thought was curiosity, a chance to finally learn something about the man. The first few entries were mundane weather observations, notes on planting times, the usual farmer's almanac stuff. But as I flipped further, a different tone began to emerge. The later entries spoke of the presence in the woods, the whispering wind, and the eyes beyond the glass. He wrote about feeling watched, about sounds that weren't animal, about shadows moving just beyond the reach of his porch light. I rationalized it as an old man's paranoia, living too long in isolation. The cabin was remote. Anyone would get a little stir-crazy. Still, reading those words late at night, with the wind rattling the single window in my bedroom, sent a shiver down my spine. I started closing the heavy wooden shutters before dark, something I hadn't bothered with before. The journal became a morbid fascination, a forbidden text I couldn't put down. One evening, around midnight, I was still reading by the dim light of an oil lamp when the wind outside completely died. It wasn't a gradual calming. It was an abrupt cessation. The trees, which had been rustling just moments before, became unnaturally still. The cicadas, usually a constant chorus, went silent. It was as if the entire forest held its breath. I looked up from the journal, my heart starting to pound. The silence was heavier than any sound could have been. Felt wrong, like the world had paused just for me. I strained my ears, listening for anything, but there was only the thumping of my own pulse. I tried to tell myself it was just a temporary weather shift, but a cold dread began to settle over me. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate crunch of leaves just outside the cabin, near the side wall. Not an animal, too rhythmic, too heavy. It sounded like footsteps. My breath hitched. I froze, holding the black book tightly. The footsteps moved slowly, making a circuit around the cabin. 1, 2, 3, each step distinct, like someone was pacing, measuring. I clutched the lamp, wanting to run, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. The pacing stopped right outside my bedroom window, the one I had closed and shuttered earlier. I could almost feel a presence on the other side of the wood, a heavy, silent weight. I squeezed my eyes shut, wishing I hadn't read a single page of that damned book. A low, guttural whisper scraped against the wood of the shutter. It wasn't words, not really, but a sound that conveyed intent, a hungry sort of curiosity. It was deep, resonating, and utterly inhuman. My blood ran cold. I could feel the vibrations of that sound through the floorboards. It lingered for what felt like an eternity. Then a faint scratching began, delicate at first, then growing more insistent, like long fingernails dragging across the rough timber of the window frame. It wasn't trying to get in, not yet. It was more like testing, exploring, letting me know it was there. I stayed absolutely still, barely breathing, convinced that any movement would provoke it, would invite it in. The scratching eventually faded, replaced by that suffocating silence. I didn't dare move until dawn began to filter through the cracks in the shutters. When I finally did, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the book. I opened it again, needing to understand what my uncle had experienced, what he knew. I flipped to the last entry. It wasn't writing this time. The entire final page was scorched black, not by fire, but as if the ink itself had burned through the paper. And on the facing page, scrawled in a frantic, almost unreadable hand, were just 2 words. It knows. My uncle hadn't been paranoid. He had been warning me. I scrambled out of the cabin, the black book still clutched in my hand, and practically dove into my car. My mind raced, filled with a desperate need to get as far away as possible. I turned the key. Nothing. Tried again and again. The engine just clicked, a lifeless, mocking sound. I tried the headlights. They flickered weakly, then died. The battery was dead. It had been fine yesterday. Panic clawed at my throat. I looked up at the cabin, its dark windows staring back. Then I looked at the dark, silent forest around me. The path back home, a long, impossible walk. I was trapped. And the black book, the thing I wanted to throw into the deepest ravine, still lay open on the passenger seat. I spent the night huddled in the cabin, the only light coming from the fireplace. Every creak of the old wood, every rustle of leaves outside, sent a jolt through me. I kept glancing at the black book, still on the passenger seat of my dead car, unable to bring myself to touch it again. Around 3 a.m., a strange orange glow began to emanate from the trees in the distance. It wasn't moonlight. It was too bright, too steady. A fire. A wildfire, perhaps, starting somewhere deep in the woods. But as I watched, the glow intensified, pulsed, and seemed to get closer, moving through the dense foliage with an impossible speed. It wasn't a natural fire. It felt like a gaze, slowly, deliberately, turning towards the cabin, towards me. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that it had read me just as surely as I had read the book. The things we find, the secrets we unearth, they don't always stay contained within the pages of a journal or the walls of an old building. Sometimes they follow you home. Sometimes they just watch. The old canvas duffel bag sat by the door, still packed from my last trip up to the family cabin. Even though I'd been back in civilization for nearly 2 weeks. It was a small thing, but it gnawed at me, a lingering bit of unfinished business. My dad, bless his heart, had always been a stickler for putting things away immediately, a habit he tried to instill in me with moderate success. I was 24 then, living alone in a small apartment an hour's drive from the state park where our cabin sat, nestled deep in the woods. This particular visit, though, had been different. Something felt off when I left, and I couldn't quite shake it. My parents owned this cabin, a rustic, 2-bedroom place they'd bought when I was a kid. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape, a place to disconnect. Usually, I loved it, the quiet hum of the trees, the smell of pine and damp earth. This time, I'd gone up alone for a long weekend, needing a break from work. The first day was fine, just me and my books, the crackle of the fireplace. But then, on the second afternoon, I found something tucked away in a forgotten chest in the cabin's small, dusty attic. It was a book, bound in rough, black leather, with no title, just a single, unsettling symbol etched into the cover. The symbol was crude, like something scratched with a sharp stick, A circle with 3 lines radiating outwards, uneven and jagged. The book felt cold to the touch, heavy, and strangely dense. I remember thinking it was probably just some old journal or a strange family heirloom I'd never seen before. Curiosity got the better of me. The pages inside were thick, yellowed, and filled with cramped, almost illegible handwriting. It wasn't English or any language I recognized. The characters were sharp, angular, almost like thorny branches, filling page after page in dark, faded ink. I spent hours trying to make sense of it, feeling an odd pull, almost a compulsion, to understand what I was looking at. As I read, or rather stared at the foreign script, I started hearing things. Faint whispers, like wind through dry leaves, but closer, almost inside the cabin. They seemed to emanate from the walls, or maybe from the corners of the room. It was subtle at first, easily dismissed as the old house settling, or just my imagination running wild in the quiet. But the whispers grew, becoming more distinct, a low, guttural murmur that felt wrong. The air in the cabin also began to change. A deep, unnatural cold seeped into the living room, even with the fireplace roaring. I'd pile on blankets, but the chill would find its way through, raising goosebumps on my arms. I distinctly remember the flame in the fireplace flickering wildly, dancing as if caught in a sudden, invisible draft, even though all the windows and doors were latched tight. The whispers would intensify then, swirling around me, almost forming coherent words I couldn't quite grasp, just on the edge of my hearing. It was enough to make my stomach clench with a rising unease. One morning, I found a small, dark stain on the wooden floor beside the armchair where I'd been reading the book. It was an almost imperceptible reddish-brown, like dried blood, but I couldn't remember spilling anything. I tried to wipe it away with a damp cloth, but it wouldn't budge. It just sat there, a tiny, ominous mark. That's when the fear really started to set in, a cold dread that clung to me. I slammed the black book shut, shoved it back into the chest in the attic, and decided it was time to leave. I packed my things in a hurry, not even bothering to properly clean up. As I drove away from the cabin, I felt a powerful sense of relief, but it was tainted with something else. A strange smell seemed to follow me, a faint, metallic odor, like old pennies and something else, something distinctly unpleasant, almost organic. It wasn't strong enough to be overwhelming, but it was there, persistent, catching in the back of my throat. I rolled down the windows, thinking it was just the car, but the smell persisted, even on the open highway. It felt like it had seeped into my clothes, into my hair, a part of me now. When I got back to my apartment, I threw my duffel bag into the corner, too exhausted and unnerved to unpack. That night, I tried to sleep, but the strange scent lingered. The next morning, I finally decided to unpack the bag, and there it was, sitting right on top of my folded clothes, nestled among my t-shirts. The black book. The same rough leather, the same etched symbol. My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew with absolute certainty that I had put it back in the attic chest. I had seen it there. There was no way it could have traveled with me. I stared at it for a long time, a suffocating wave of fear washing over me. It felt like the cabin had followed me, like a part of that unsettling place had latched onto me and hadn't let go. I didn't touch the book. I just left it there on the floor, still in the duffel bag. Days turned into weeks, and the duffel bag stayed by the door, the black book still inside. The metallic scent never completely left, just faded to a barely noticeable whisper in the air. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I still feel that unnatural, deep cold settling in a corner of my apartment, just like it did in the cabin. I haven't opened the book again, and I haven't returned to the cabin. I can't bring myself to. The thought of it, of that black book, fills me with a kind of primal dread. Sometimes, I catch myself looking at the corner where the duffel bag sits, feeling a strange pressure, like being watched. It's not just the memory of the cabin anymore. It feels like the cabin, or whatever was in it, is here in my apartment silently waiting. And I know, deep down, that the black book is still in that bag, its strange cold eye watching from the shadows. These stories, they remind us that the line between the known and the unknown is thinner than we often care to admit, and that some places, some histories, carry a weight that never truly fades, a resonance that stays with you, a quiet echo in the back of your mind. They remind us that sometimes the real horror isn't what jumps out at you, but what slowly, quietly reveals itself to be true. If you found yourself drawn into these shadows, consider joining us for a new story every week.